Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I did this drawing of Millie, a black and white cat in pastels. Now as always, the first thing I like to start with are the eyes. Now Millie had quite vibrant light coloured eyes here, so I wanted to make sure that I got the colour saturation accurate right from the very beginning. Now as always, when drawing realistic eyes, the shading is important, so you can see here that I'm building up my lighter and darker values in stages. Now when drawing really bright eyes like this, I don't strictly work from dark to light, so I was being a little bit more cautious of the lighter colours first, making sure that I had that in place and then I can darken them later where needed. This just gives a little bit more of that reassurance that the base layer is not going to be too dark and then run the risk of those colours also being too dark or potentially dull depending on how vibrant that colour needs to be. Now when drawing realistic black or white fur, the layering process is very important. Now depending on the reference photo, the way that that pastel needs to be applied, whether or not it's dark to light or light to dark, is going to vary depending on the light source and many different factors in that reference photo. Now what I'm going to do is upload a couple of shorter videos that show more of the real-time clips in the drawing process where I can really focus on how to draw realistic black fur, and I'll also do the same for the white fur. So I will have those uploaded as a couple of extra tutorials very soon here on YouTube. I do have lots of real-time tutorials on my Patreon channel and I'm recording those with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so every single process is explained thoroughly in the moment. There are no sections sped up or cut out. If you are interested in any of those lessons, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. Now regardless of whether I'm working dark to light or light to dark, I need to be making sure that I'm using the right number of layers. Now as you can see here where I'm building up the depth within the ear, I started off with drawing the skin of the back of the ear first and then I built up the fur details over the top. Now this is going to give a much more realistic look because that fur is naturally sitting above the skin of the ear, but I want to be making sure that I don't fill the tooth of the paper too soon. If the tooth of the paper is filled, then the way that the pastel pencils are applied on top is going to be massively affected. If you do feel like the pencils are just gliding over the surface and not much pigment is leaving the pencil, that is an indication that the tooth of the paper has been filled. So being cautious to work with multiple layers and not filling the tooth of the paper initially is very, very important. Now when working on the eye here, you can see just how many layers that I'm adding. I'm really focusing on building up those values and colour in stages. Being able to do that is going to massively affect how realistic and three-dimensional the portrait is going to be when finished. Now when it came to working on the black fur around the eye, this is one of those areas where it was at its darkest. Now one of my biggest tips for drawing black fur is to make sure that that base foundation is dark enough from the beginning. Now the reason being, this is going to massively affect how three-dimensional the portrait is going to look. Sometimes we can be a bit more cautious for fear of going too dark at the base layer stage, but what that does is it eventually just makes all of the layers that we add on top too light as well. So the depth, the contrast, it gets massively affected. And as you can see here, with using the right pencil technique, even with that base foundation being as dark as it is, those white details on top are still showing up. But one thing that is very important is you'll notice there that I didn't just use my white pencils directly on top. I did use a couple of my darker shades, which were barely visible, but they do help to provide some of that softness before those lighter details are added. Now one thing I talk about in my real-time tutorials is that there is no set rule. So although I've just mentioned that I like to put in a bit more of my subtle values over the top of my dark base before I jump into my highlights, there is always one of those occasions where that's not quite true, and this ear is a great example. I've started here with my white pencil and put in those details directly over the top of a dark base foundation. Now the reason being is the hair here on the inner ear is very different in how it's catching the light compared to the other ear. The other ear has more of those hairs visible that are catching that direct light source, so therefore they're looking more of that thicker, fuller layer. Whereas the ear on the right hand side has more of the individual hairs that are only just catching that light. So using that pencil technique in a very structured but individual way, making sure that we're tweaking it for one section compared to the next, is what helps to make the portrait look more realistic. Now noticing where those layering techniques need to be slightly tweaked is what's going to help make that portrait look more natural. Now one thing that can help identify what layering process needs to be used in each area is to work in smaller chunks. So you can see that I worked on the eye, the fur around the eye, each ear individually and so on. I'm now blocking in the areas on the nose and really hinting at the way the light is catching each of those areas. If I were to work in whole individual layers, I think I personally would have more of a tendency to skip through some of those changes in the layers. Now, of course, there's no right or wrong way of working. It's all individual to each artist, but if you do find yourself rushing or potentially starting to hesitate, looking at that reference photo, not quite sure where you should be, that is an indication that you're working on a little bit too much of a larger area. So just scaling that down can really help. Now, I also think that white fur can be one of the more challenging fur colours to get right. Because there's often a lot of those very subtle midtones that need to be captured that can often end up being skipped over. It's another reason why I like to work in smaller sections. So here I'm really focusing on any areas that I need to make even just a little bit darker. That's going to help build up more shape and form. Now the highlights and shadows in their placement are not random. They do follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. It's exactly the same reason as why I focus so much on the fur direction. Now as I move my pencil, I'm trying to capture those main fur directional changes because that also helps to build up that realistic shape of the face. Now as well as the fur direction, the length of our pencil strokes is also important. This is going to vary massively from one section to the next. You can see there with those little white hairs that overlap the side of the face, I'm making sure that I've got more of a natural variety. So there's a different range of lengths of those pencil strokes and they also curve in different directions as well. This is going to be influenced more when working with longer fur. Shorter fur has a little bit more structure to it, but I still want to be making sure that I've got that natural variation. That is something that I feel is really important. Now another thing that I focus on is what should I draw first? Now if you have fur that overlaps an area, it always makes it easier to draw what's beneath that section initially and then you can overlap your details on top. Now that's why I added in with the eye makeup applicator the little bit of the black fur on the body on the left hand side and then I went back in with my white pencil to add the hairs on the side of the face on top. If I'd have added those white hairs first and then tried putting in the body, I'm going to have to either draw around those details or completely overlap them and then redraw them. So it's just something that is always worth paying attention to in the reference photo. Not only does it make that drawing process a little bit faster, but it is just easier to then break down that layering process. Now as I start to build up the base foundation here with my pastel pencils, you can see that I'm always working with glazes to adjust the colour. Now a glaze when working with pastel pencils is something that I do cover thoroughly in my real-time tutorials. You can see that I'm using the side of the lead and I just do a very thin layer of that colour, blend that out and then adjust another colour on top if I need to. Now with each glaze or layer that I add, I'm always blending it as well. Now this is something that I do feel is really important when drawing any fur of any colour. I personally feel that a smoother blended base layer makes it much easier for drawing realistic fur on top. If that base foundation has start and stop points, that harshness I feel comes through in the pencil details as well. So a fur like this that should have more of a natural softer texture, it's potentially going to look a little bit more wiry if the base layer isn't as blended. Now this is just the way that I prefer to draw, but it is something that I do feel helps with how realistic the fur can be captured. Now when I'm also adjusting the colour of the fur, you can see that I'm doing that before I work with my lighter pencils. If I ever do feel like there's a little bit more of a yellower tint or maybe a green tint if that animal is sat on some grass, I want to be making sure that I've incorporated that, but that I don't actually draw the details with a green pencil. Adjusting the colour at the right stage, especially when drawing white fur, is crucial. Here is a great example of that. You can see that I'm adjusting the colour now. I don't actually use my browns or my pinks, my yellows, whatever it may be, on the top of my details. I want to be making sure that I'm adjusting that colour before I get to that stage. Now, regarding colour, this is something that is going to be very subjective depending on what you want to achieve in your drawing. If I had a reference photo and the animal was sat on grass and it had a very, very strong green tint to it, but I wasn't including any grass in my portrait, that's something that I might potentially tone down in my drawing. I'd have a hint of colour there, but I may not include it to the same degree as the reference photo. But of course, this is going to depend on the scenario, how much of that we are looking to incorporate in the drawing. Now, when it came to working on the chest, this is where, again, fur direction, tonal values, the layering process is just as important. Now, in some cases, the chest fur here, it might look a little bit more textured. I want to be making sure, if that's the case, that I've got more separation in my pencil strokes. So therefore the fur might look a little bit more clumped together. This area here is showing that perfectly. And in order to do that, I'm working with a little bit more of a flatter pencil technique. Maybe I'm using a little bit more pressure, just something that's enabling me to capture a range of those fur textures. I also am still focusing on how dark that base layer should be. And again, I'm not rushing into just putting in a dark layer and then forcing my lighter details on top. I'm always working with those layers of subtlety. Now also, depending on the light source, that's going to affect how dark that base layer should be. So this side of the body is significantly lighter than the other side, and with that other side I'm going to be incorporating a lot more of the colour. So lots more of my warmer values, some of those brown tones, some pinks, and I want to be making sure here that I've captured the way that it curves over. So you can see on the lower part of the chest, that's more typically of those warmer greys. That colour, the pinks, they do not go all the way down to the lower part of the chest. So all of these colours, those tones, it is going to be determined by the light source. Now the reference photo that I had for this portrait, it really was beautiful. That stronger one-sided light source can add a huge amount of depth to a drawing. It certainly makes it more interesting, and I want to be making sure that I've captured that. But here, again, just because it's so important, I'm starting with those subtle values first. I'm not jumping into using my white pencils. And then, as always, the last thing I like to include is my whiskers. They do overlap everything else, so I do like to leave those for the very last layer. So I do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.